On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. More than 3 million Axis soldiers, over 3,500 tanks, and thousands of aircraft crossed the Soviet border. The German blitzkrieg was devastating. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were captured. Airfields were destroyed before many Soviet pilots even managed to take off. Within weeks, Germany had advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. To many observers, it looked like the Soviet Union was collapsing. Even Hitler believed the campaign would be over before winter. German officers confidently predicted victory within a few months. But behind the front lines, Soviet leaders were preparing to make a decision that would change everything. It wasn't about launching a massive counterattack. It wasn't about negotiating peace. Instead, it involved sacrificing something enormous in order to save the future of the nation. At first glance, the decision seemed almost insane. The Soviet government ordered the evacuation of its industries from Western Russia. Thousands of factories, along with their machinery, workers, engineers, and even their families, would be dismantled piece by piece and transported thousands of kilometers east beyond the Ural Mountains. Imagine trying to move an entire industrial civilization while the enemy is only days away. Machines weighing dozens of tons had to be taken apart. Railroads were overloaded. Entire cities were packing up overnight. Many workers slept beside railway tracks while waiting for transport. Some factories continued producing tanks and artillery shells until the very last moment before being dismantled. Then the equipment was loaded onto trains and sent east. It became one of the greatest industrial evacuations in human history. More than 1,500 major factories were relocated. Over 10 million civilians were evacuated alongside vital equipment. The journey was brutal. Some trains traveled for weeks. Food was scarce. Many workers lived in tents or unfinished buildings after arriving in Siberia and the Urals. Yet despite these hardships, they immediately began rebuilding production. There were no modern cranes, no advanced logistics software. Everything depended on determination, organization, and relentless effort. Entire factories were rebuilt in empty fields. Sometimes production began before walls or roofs were even completed. Workers assembled tanks outdoors in freezing temperatures. Women, teenagers, and elderly citizens joined the workforce because millions of men were already fighting at the front. The Soviet Union understood one simple truth. If the factories survived, the country could survive. If the factories were lost, the war would be lost. And that single realization became the foundation of everything that followed. While Soviet factories were being rebuilt deep beyond the Ural Mountains, Hitler believed he had already won. German intelligence estimated that the Soviet Union had lost most of its industrial capacity. From Berlin's perspective, there was no way the Red Army could replace its destroyed tanks, aircraft, and artillery. It was a fatal miscalculation. By the end of 1941, something extraordinary was happening. The factories that had been moved thousands of miles east were coming back to life. Assembly lines restarted. Steel mills roared again. Tank plants began producing new armored vehicles almost around the clock. Workers labored in 12 to 16-hour shifts, often surviving on minimal food and little sleep. Many of them never complained because they understood what was at stake. Every tank they built could save soldiers at the front. Every artillery shell could stop another German advance. The Soviet government gave these factories one mission: produce faster than Germany could destroy. Soon that mission became reality. The legendary T-34 tank rolled off the assembly lines in massive numbers. Simple, reliable, and easy to manufacture, it became one of the most effective tanks of the war. New aircraft such as the Il-2 also entered production in huge numbers. Nicknamed the flying tank, it became a nightmare for German ground forces. Hitler had expected Soviet production to collapse. Instead, it was growing stronger every month. As winter arrived in late 1941, German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow. They could almost see the Soviet capital. Many believed victory was only days away. But the Red Army was no longer the broken force Germany had faced in June. Fresh divisions arrived from Siberia. New tanks and artillery, built in the relocated factories, reached the front. For the first time since Operation Barbarossa began, the Germans were forced onto the defensive. The Soviet counteroffensive outside Moscow shocked the world. The myth of the unstoppable Wehrmacht had been broken. From that moment on, Germany was fighting a war it could no longer win quickly. And the longer the war lasted, the more dangerous the Soviet industrial machine became. Every month, more factories opened. Every month, more tanks, aircraft, trucks, and ammunition poured out of the east. The decision to move Soviet industry had transformed what looked like certain defeat into a growing military advantage. Hitler had conquered cities, but he had failed to destroy the Soviet Union's ability to keep fighting. By 1942, the balance of the war had begun to change. Germany still occupied vast areas of Soviet territory, but every mile it advanced came at a terrible cost. Fuel was becoming scarce, experienced soldiers were irreplaceable, and German factories simply could not keep up with the growing demands of a long war. Meanwhile, far beyond the reach of German bombers, Soviet factories were operating day and night. Thousands of tanks, aircraft, artillery guns, and millions of rounds of ammunition poured out of the assembly lines. Every month, the Red Army became stronger while Germany grew weaker. This industrial strength would soon prove decisive at one of the most important battles in history, Stalingrad. When the German Sixth Army became trapped inside the city, the Soviet Union had the resources to launch massive counteroffensives from multiple directions. Fresh tanks, fresh artillery, fresh supplies, all made possible because Soviet industry had survived. More than 300,000 Axis soldiers were surrounded, and after months of desperate fighting, Germany suffered one of its greatest military disasters. Hitler refused to believe the situation was hopeless. Instead of changing his strategy, he ordered another major offensive in 1943. This time the target was Kursk. It would become the largest tank battle ever fought. But once again, Soviet industry had done its job. The Red Army had produced thousands of new tanks, built deep defensive lines, and stockpiled enormous quantities of ammunition. When Germany attacked, it met an enemy stronger than ever before. After Kursk, Germany permanently lost the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. From then on, it was the Soviet Union that kept advancing. City after city was liberated. The Red Army pushed west through Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and eventually into Germany itself. By April 1945, Soviet troops were fighting in the streets of Berlin. Only weeks later, Hitler was dead, and Nazi Germany surrendered. Looking back, it's easy to think battles like Stalingrad or Berlin destroyed Hitler's empire. But those victories were only possible because of a decision made almost 4 years earlier. When Soviet leaders chose to dismantle and relocate their industries instead of letting them fall into German hands, they preserved the country's ability to wage war. It was one of the greatest logistical operations in human history. More than 1,500 factories were moved. Millions of workers and civilians were relocated. Production restarted under impossible conditions. Without that effort, the Soviet Union might never have recovered from the disasters of 1941. Hitler's armies captured land, but they failed to destroy the Soviet Union's industrial heart. And in modern war, factories can be just as important as soldiers. In the end, it wasn't just courage on the battlefield that defeated Nazi Germany. It was planning, sacrifice, industrial power, and one extraordinary decision that ensured the Soviet Union could keep fighting until victory. Sometimes history isn't changed by a single battle. It's changed by a single decision. One reason this Soviet decision proved so successful was that Germany never fully understood what was happening behind the front lines. German reconnaissance aircraft could see trains moving east, but they underestimated the scale of the evacuation. Hitler believed the Soviet Union would run out of weapons long before those factories could begin producing again. He was wrong. By early 1942, Soviet production had not only recovered, it had surpassed pre-war levels in several key industries. The Soviet Union was producing tanks faster than Germany. Aircraft factories were delivering hundreds of new fighters and attack planes every month. Artillery production reached levels the Germans simply could not match. This gave Soviet commanders something Germany increasingly lacked: the ability to replace losses quickly. If Germany lost 100 tanks, replacing them was difficult. If the Soviet Union lost 100 tanks, hundreds more were already leaving the factories. That difference slowly changed the entire war. German soldiers began noticing that every offensive became harder than the last. Even after destroying large numbers of Soviet equipment, they kept facing fresh units equipped with new tanks and artillery. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more World War II history.